Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala, ma ba'd. One of the common confusions that we have as Muslims in America, or as Muslims in general, is learning how to balance between the hope and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment. So when we look at how Islam is taught at usually back home, where we came from, a lot of the times we see that Islam is taught as, first of all, something as a set of rules and obligations, and we are not usually taught the wisdoms behind these rules or the logical explanation of why we have the rules of Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam has placed for us. And so when we are taught these rules, there's some sort of force, and there's some sort of a cultural aspect that's related to them. It's like if you don't memorize the surah that you're supposed to learn every day, then someone's going to hit you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to punish you. You look at if you don't pray, then Allah is going to punish you. If you don't do this, then Allah is going to punish you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment is very vast, and His anger is extremely harsh. And if you don't do something, then He's going to be extremely angry with you. And so that's one extreme when we look at how it is back home. When you look at how it is nowadays in our communities in the West, we have kind of adopted another extreme. And this is something that we have to be unapologetic about. We have adopted this sense of, the hope and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is true. But we have taken it to such an extent that we use it to, become an excuse for our complacency. And so a lot of times we don't do certain actions in Islam, and we kind of bank it on that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to forgive me at the end. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy is no bounds. So whatever I do bad, it doesn't matter because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to forgive me. This is actually the aqeedah of the Christians and the Jews. The whole aspect of why Jesus died for their sins was just an excuse for them to become complacent whenever they do. And so we see this aspect of outside influence becoming an effect in our deen. And so the proper understanding of how to balance between the hope and the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment is when Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawzi rahimahullah mentions in his book, he talks about the analogy of a bird. And he said, the iman of a believer is like a bird. The head of the bird is the love and the mercy of Allah. The head of the bird is the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The wings of the bird on the right side, the right wing is the hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, and the left wing is fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment. He goes on to mention that if you were to cut off the head, then the bird would become dead. Meaning that if you were to cut off the love of Allah, if you were not to love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that essentially means that you have left the fold of Islam. He said that if you cut off either wing, the plane, what will happen to the bird is that it's going to go back and forth, and ultimately it's going to fall. And so he said, same thing in Islam for us Muslims. If we only have hope in Allah, or if we only fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment, then it will lead us to go down and more down and more down and more down. And he also said that if there is an imbalance, then the bird is also not able to fly. And so if we put more, if we put more towards the hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or more towards the punishment of Allah, then you're also going to become imbalanced. The best way to balance it is this quote that I read. It said that Islam comes to comfort the shaken and shake those who are comfortable. If you're feeling complacent, or you're feeling extremely comfortable in your position with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're starting to see yourself sin, and you start to see yourself not caring about it, then that is when you talk about the fear of Allah, and that is when you try to fill in the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into your heart. And you read the ayahs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's punishment and understand the relationship that we have with Allah isn't just about love and mercy and He will forgive you and He'll forgive you. No, if you're going to cross the boundaries of Allah, He will punish you. But then sometimes, and a lot of times, especially for us in America, we feel extremely, we're working on a relationship with Allah, and sometimes it becomes difficult. Sometimes it becomes extremely hard to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commandments. Sometimes we go through different things in our families and we become depressed. At this time, This is when you read the ayahs of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you try to comfort yourself. So it depends on your position with Allah. It depends on your position in life. If you feel like you are extremely complacent and you start to feel lazy in your a'mal, this is when you read the ayat of the punishment and fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you instill that. If you start to feel like you're doing your best and things are not working out, or you feel like you're extremely sad, or you're depressed, or you feel like you need a boost in your iman, then you read the ayahs of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you try to console yourself towards that, and it's supposed to lead you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But at the end of the day, Ibn al-Qayyim said that every single thing, whatever, even if you go towards with the hope of Allah or you go with the fear of Allah, it's supposed to lead towards the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to instill within us the love of Allah, and ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to balance between